Ben Johnson is the betting favorite to win NFL Coach of the Year, and he can learn some really important lessons from the last time a Chicago Bears head coach won Coach of the Year in his first season.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On the show today, I want to compare Ben Johnson entering his first season as the Coach of the Year favorite to the last Chicago Bears first-year Coach of the Year, Matt Nagy, back in 2018. And I want to look at what Matt Nagy did to win Coach of the Year that year that Ben Johnson should try and emulate, at least the good aspects of what Matt Nagy did. We'll also look at where things went wrong for Matt Nagy and why winning Coach of the Year in the first year didn't lead to a successful coaching term, and the lessons Ben Johnson should learn from Matt Nagy having won Coach of the Year. And then I kind of want to also then go into what's different about Ben's situation from Nagy's situation, because there are a lot of similarities that can lead you down the path towards Ben winning it, but then maybe some of the things that are different about it could help that success be more sustainable. This time, we'll compare where these two coaches are and what that future might look like for Ben Johnson. But it's easy to forget, with how much Matt Nagy was vilified in some ways justifiably, maybe sometimes a little bit over the top, but we don't think about Matt Nagy as being a very successful Chicago Bears head coach because he was fired after 3 seasons, right? Or is it 4? It's 18, 19, 20, 21. After 4 seasons, he was fired. And so being that much of a disappointment in the end, we look back and say, another bad Bears head coach, but it's easy to forget. Year 1, 12-4, NFL Coach of the Year, beats the Green Bay Packers, wins the NFC North, goes to the playoffs, a home playoff game. And, I don't remember exactly what happened in that home playoff game, right? No one really remembers what happened in that home playoff game. But regardless, we know that was a really fun, strong, successful first season. I mean, Mitch Trubisky threw for 6 touchdowns in a game that season. The defense was the number 1 defense in football and absolutely dominated. There was so much to like and enjoy about that 2018 season. And so I wanted to deconstruct it a little bit to look at what happened and how they were able to get to Matt Nagy winning Coach of the Year and some of the similarities that might align with where the Bears are right now entering 2025. In that offseason leading up to the 2018 season, you saw Matt Nagy and Ryan Pace at the time go out and really revamp some of the weapons on offense to support their young quarterback. They signed Allen Robinson in free agency. They brought in Taylor Gabriel to be the number 2, added a new top tight end in Trey Burton. There was very much an emphasis on building around and supporting this young quarterback, right? Second-year QB needs some extra help, so go get an offensive play-calling head coach, get him some better weapons. That all made a lot of sense at the time, and everyone was pretty excited about the things the Bears did. They went on to draft a young wide receiver in the second round as well to add another weapon in the form of Anthony Miller. They drafted James Daniels in the second round to try and boost the offensive line. That much in some of the ways we've talked about the Bears building around Caleb Williams with the coach, with the personnel that he needs. They did a lot of those same things for Mitch Trubisky, and a lot of those things worked for at least 2018. I don't think we think back of Trey Burton being a great free agent signing, but he had almost 600 yards that season, and Allen Robinson was injured a bit that year, but when he was healthy, he was playing at a high level. Taylor Gabriel had almost 700 yards that season. Sure, they weren't great free agent signings in the long run, but in the short term, those upgrades around the quarterback did make a big difference for the offense. I should mention, too, that they go out, instead of having Mike Glennon be Trubisky's backup. They get a veteran backup quarterback who's kind of like a quarterback coach in the room in Chase Daniel to mentor Trubisky throughout this process. And I can't help but feel some similarities there with the Bears grabbing a new backup quarterback for Caleb Williams in the form of Case Keenum to be that kind of veteran mentor more than like a true high-quality player in case he has to be in the game. But then, all the emphasis on weapons around Caleb Williams and rebuilding the offensive line around Caleb Williams, around getting an offensive-minded head coach to be the play caller for Caleb Williams. There's some real similarities there. We also saw the Bears at that time move on from some of their older veterans and injured guys on the roster. It's kind of changing over from the previous regime. They got rid of linebacker Jarrell Freeman and edge rushers Pernell McPhee and Willie Young and Lamar Houston and even Josh Sitton on the offensive line. Like, they kind of had to cut some of the bait from previous regimes. And we've seen the Bears not make as massive, as big of a transition this year, but, you move on from Tevin Jenkins, you move on from DeMarcus Walker, you move on from Coleman Shelton and a bunch of guys on the interior of the offensive line. Like, some of that changeover of guys that just weren't healthy enough and durable and reliable enough goes a long way. And we've seen some of that same stuff happening now with the Bears. Then from a coaching standpoint, right, you pair your veteran coaches with your inexperienced guys, like Matt Nagy, first-time head coach, and in this case, first-time play caller. So he goes and gets a veteran defensive coordinator in Vic Fangio, and to help him out on offense, gets a veteran former head coach in Brad Childress to not be offensive coordinator or anything, but at least on the staff to kind of help mentor him through a lot of that process. And I think we see some similarities with Ben Johnson making Dennis Allen his defensive coordinator, and then on offense, bringing in experienced coaches like Eric Bieniemy, the running backs coach, or Press Taylor as passing game coordinator, guys who've been around the block a little bit and have seen how other organizations run on the coaching staff. But then Matt Nagy was pretty hands-off with Vic Fangio and kind of let him do his thing. I think that's something Ben Johnson needs to do the same thing, like just the right amount of like paying attention to it and supporting without really getting in the way of what they're doing. And then he's just found ways to have fun with it. Do you remember how fun the 2018 season was? Besides just obviously the winning is fun when you're going 12-4, but like they would have, club dub after games. And I'm not saying Ben Johnson needs to have, those same style of, you could call them gimmicks, you can call them whatever you might want to, but just ways that players can have fun with it. The trick plays, they ran, was 2018 when they ran, Santa's sleigh, and they had all the different names for trick plays. They run at the goal line, they'd hand it off to Akeem Hicks or throw it to Bradley Soul in the end zone. Like, it's stuff that actually like worked. It wasn't about getting too cute, but just like getting players involved and really having a good time with it. Matt Nagy, you remember in the locker room after games, he would drop the boom, in the middle of the huddle. They'd kind of like make the noise, then he'd throw the boom down in the middle of the huddle. Like, he found a way to like really connect with these guys and make it this fun energy that wasn't like all jokes and no serious, they were still had to win the games and stuff, but they were able to really kind of celebrate and lean into that. And none of it felt, hollow or empty when, some of it became a punchline later on, like the BU stuff, but it felt really real in 2018 because they were winning games and everything seemed to be lining up really, really well. And I think Ben Johnson has some of that same ability to like call up some trick plays, do the stumble bum play and stuff that like players just get to buy in a little bit more while also being serious and intense and taking the football stuff as serious as you need to, and kind of mixing that youth and experience both on the coaching staff and on the roster by getting rid of some of the older guys from the previous regime and getting some guys that and that you can rely on a little bit more to help you with the transition, taking over as a first-year head coach. So like you could kind of see where Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles, it's a collaborative thing there, have gone down a similar, let's say, type of approach. You hope that the moves Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles have made are a little bit more long-term sustainable and better than the way guys like Allen Robinson and Trey Burton and Anthony Miller and some others ended up panning out. And that's part of why Matt Nagy wasn't able to sustain success. But I think there were also some aspects that Matt Nagy didn't necessarily handle super well, like managing the success. Like, okay, everything's great now. And so sometimes you can fall in a little bit to just assuming things are going to keep being great. And you kind of don't realize how much you're losing and how much is changing in the process because of how great you were. So I want to look at why some things weren't as sustainable for Matt Nagy and some of the lessons Ben Johnson should take from that as he applies to his own team this year, next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Gametime. We've all been there. You log on early and wait forever for concert tickets to go on sale, only to lose your spot for the show that you've been dying to see. For me, live music should be about making memories, not dealing with the stress of ticket shopping, and that's where Gametime comes in. I've got the Gametime app on my phone, and I use it to go to concerts all the time. They make getting concert tickets faster and easier than ever because you can see your view from your seat, so you know exactly what you're getting before you make your ticket purchase. And there's no hidden fees in the Gametime app. The price you see is the price you pay, and the Gametime guarantee has your back with the lowest price and cancellation protection. So take the guesswork out of buying concert and show tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem that code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. I don't want to overlook how difficult it is to win NFL Coach of the Year. But sometimes it can be easy when we look back at hindsight and say, all right, well, that was the easy part. Now sustain that success and now be really good for multiple seasons, which, I do think is also kind of maybe even the harder part. Like, we've seen plenty of flashes in the pan that aren't sustainable because you have one good year and then things kind of fall apart. So I don't want to make it a foregone conclusion, right? That, just because Ben Johnson's the favorite to win Coach of the Year, that he's going to win Coach of the Year and then should be preparing this season for next year as though he has won Coach of the Year. Because even when you look at the odds, Mike Vrabel with the Patriots is right behind him, a very close second for Coach of the Year. And then you got Liam Cohen of the Jaguars is in there. Aaron Glenn, former Lions teammate of Ben Johnson's in there. And then there's another gap between Mike McDonald, Pete Carroll, Dave Canales and stuff. But nonetheless, I want to make sure that we emphasize here, you can't just assume Ben Johnson's going to win Coach of the Year. At the same time, to me, the lessons from Matt Nagy are less about do you win the award or not, and more about, hey, you had a lot of success in your first year. How do you make sure that success carries over into year two? And I think perhaps they underestimated some of the things that became more difficult than they would have thought. That first of all, when you're a team like the 2018 Chicago Bears that was so dominant on defense, remember, people were having conversations of I don't think anyone was saying that defense was better than the 1985 Chicago Bears, but it was drawing some conversations of is this the best defense since the 1985 Chicago Bears? Is this Bears defense better than the 2006 Super Bowl defense or the 2010 NFC Championship defense? Number 1 in points allowed, number 3 in yards allowed, number 1 in turnovers and interceptions, top 10 in passing, number 1 in rushing stopped. They were dominant. The lowest percentage of drives ending in scores. It was a really great defense. And I think sometimes in the NFL, we have this assumption that the defense was great the year before, so it's instantly then for sure going to be great the next year. And that's just not only is it not always the case, but it's particularly difficult to do. And to be clear, the Bears defense remained a top 5 group in the second year of the Matt Nagy regime, but there was a little bit of a step down there. They didn't generate as many turnovers. They weren't as dominant. They couldn't lean on as much of that. And we've seen this across the NFL. Defense is really hard to sustain. It's one of the least sticky metrics in terms of when you rank really high in defense, rarely do you see the same team be, top 3 stringing together consecutive years, 2, 3, 4 years in a row. Sometimes you can do back to back, but it's really hard to keep defense at a high level. That's just something that in the NFL over time has borne out that it just fluctuates a lot. There's a lot of factors that change that. And for the Bears, of course, they were so good in 2018 that Vic Fangio gets a head coaching job and joins the Denver Broncos. You switch to Chuck Pagano, and they were still pretty good. They still had a lot of the same players, but they weren't quite as good. And then, of course, they kept progressively kind of getting less and less good to the point where then Pagano ends up leaving. And so it's one of the punishments for being a really good team is sometimes you lose good, valuable coaches, and that's really, really hard to maintain. But I also look at this Bears team, and you remember in 2018 when they won Coach of the Year, that they ended up having 8 players in the Pro Bowl. Now, to be fair, I think 4 of them were initially voted to the Pro Bowl as starters. It was Khalil Mack, Kyle Fuller, Eddie Jackson, and then the kick returner, I think, was Cordell Patterson. I think were the 4 initially voted to the Pro Bowl. And then they had 4 more guys added as alternates. Trubisky, Cody Whitehair, Tariq Cohen, and maybe even Allen Robinson. Somebody else ended up making the Pro Bowl that season. Let's see if I can find it real quick. And nonetheless, like, they had a few different Pro Bowl players that season. And how many of those guys, though, ever made another Pro Bowl? I think Eddie Jackson might have. Khalil Mack certainly did. But, like, I think you can kind of have this perception of, like, holy crap, the Bears had 8 Pro Bowl players. Eddie Jackson did make it the next year. The Bears had 8 Pro Bowl players. Oh, my gosh, this roster must be loaded. They should be just fine. And you end up kind of realizing, like, no, yes, they made the Pro Bowl, and they no one's ever going to be able to take that away from them. But they weren't necessarily all-star caliber players. They weren't on the all-pro teams. I mean, Tariq Cohen was an all-pro return man, I believe, but and I think Kyle Fuller and Eddie Jackson, like a couple of these guys, especially on the defense, were all pro guys, but a lot of the rest, Cody Whitehair never makes another Pro Bowl again. And certainly Mitch Trubisky was as borderline of a Pro Bowl player as you could possibly have, but we thought everything was fine because they were Pro Bowl players, but turns out not so much. And sometimes I think you can get a little bit ahead of yourself saying, we got all these Pro Bowl players, we're locked and loaded, when in reality, you still got to keep getting better. And instead, the next offseason, they lose Adrian Amos in free agency. They let him walk to the Packers. They let Bryce Callahan go, I think, to the Denver Broncos, if I remember. And losing those 2 players is not enough to, certainly didn't ruin the defense. They were still a top 5 defense, despite being on the decline. But you start to bleed a little bit talent here and there. And then because you traded all your draft picks for Khalil Mack, now you're not drafting until the 3rd round that year. And you don't have a 1st round pick for the next 2 seasons. And so it's hard to keep the roster constantly reloading with young, cheap talent. You don't have much salary cap space because you gave Khalil Mack the big deal. You gave Allen Robinson a pretty big contract. The Bears had a lot of the money loaded up because they had a rookie quarterback. So, of course, you want to go all in on building up the roster as best you can. But then you go after going 12-4, you get to free agency, and your big moves are Buster Screen, and Cordero Patterson was added at that point, so it would have been Cohen in the Pro Bowl. And Clinton Dix on a 1-year deal is your safety replacement, and Ted Larson is your offensive line upgrade on the interior. And it's no wonder they had some trouble sustaining that, because they couldn't keep adding. They couldn't keep reloading. They kind of were losing coaching talent and losing player talent, and then missing on free agents and not having draft picks. And it's maybe they got a little too over their skis, right? They went all in on 2018, and it worked for 2018 until you got to the playoffs, and then something happened in there. But then they couldn't sustain it because they were so all in on that 1 year. And even then, you start to see more of the cracks set in, because then Mark Helfrich gets fired after 2019, and then Chuck Pagano gets changed out after 2019. And you certainly, one of the lessons for Ben Johnson is, if you're going to lose coaches because you were so good, you got to make sure you replace them properly. And you also got to make sure that even the coaches that you have are good coaches. Even if you're good, sometimes that can mask maybe the wrong assistant, like Mark Helfrich as offensive coordinator at that time, right? It's these little kind of things. And then just sort of the sustainability of the team. At the end of the day, it's a joint thing with the general manager and the head coach sustaining success, and hitting on draft picks and free agents, and having roster flexibility to correct for mistakes is one of the biggest keys to being able to sustain that kind of success, even after a coach of the year division winning performance in that first season at the helm there. And so I think those are things that are going to be really important for Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles to keep in mind. Certainly, regardless of the success they have this season, but especially if they have success this season, because then, guys like Jaquan Brisker and Kevin Byard are entering free agency. You're going to have players on this roster that you might be able to keep, or you might have to eventually replace. You got Andrew Billings coming up in as a free agent this upcoming year. There's at least one other player that I'm forgetting here as I'm trying to quickly double check. There's another young player. So Braxton Jones on the offensive line, I suppose, is another one of these names. You got to have options, and you got to have flexibility, and they have a plan for the offensive line for sure, but they got to make sure that they do have a plan for safety. And if you make salary cap casualties of somebody like, Tremaine Edmonds potentially, or if you end up trading away somebody like Cole Kmet, right? You got to be careful how much you lose, and careful assuming that well, everything's going to be fine because we have all these good players, and this player will step up in that player's shoes, and everything will keep rolling, because it doesn't always just keep rolling the way you think it will. You have to like stay proactive and saying, no, we need to keep getting better, even if we were successful. Like, that's not good enough really until you win a Super Bowl. Like, you know what I mean? It shouldn't be good enough until you win a Super Bowl. And it felt a little bit like the Bears were in a point where the 2018 team and the lingering aspect of that had to be good enough because they couldn't really do much else. And of course, a lot of those guys didn't prove to be good enough, and that's where the success isn't sustainable. But I do think there's some specific aspects of this that are different for Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles right now than it was for Matt Nagy and Ryan Pace entering that 2018 season. So I want to look at some of the specifics of this year's Bears team that might make the success they have this season more sustainable, assuming they have that success, because of how they've built this team a little bit differently than Nagy and Pace did. And we'll look at that next on Locked On Bears. One of the things that the Bears have been careful to do under Ryan Poles is not go too all in at any one given point. Ryan Poles has really emphasized flexibility on his roster and being able to have some wiggle room and some different options, right? When we think about what they're doing at left tackle right now, you know, they've got Braxton Jones, who could be the starter and could have a great season, or they've got a second-round pick in place of him, and they're not forced into one action or the other, right? They're not forced to give Braxton Jones a big contract extension because he's their only left tackle. They're not forced to play a rookie right away, a rookie second-round pick in year one, on day one, because they have Braxton Jones, right? Same thing on the interior with Shamar Turner and Javon Dexter and Zach Pickens and Andrew Billings and Grady Jarrett, right? Give themselves options between young and old players so that they have a little bit more of this flexibility. But I also think there's some other specific aspects of the way Ben Johnson has built his team and his staff and their background that give him some better sustainability here, perhaps, than Matt Nagy had. Because this was one of the big arguments when the Bears were hiring a head coach. It's like a lot of Bears fans said, hire the offensive-minded head coach, because if you hire a guy who's a head coach who's not your play caller, if you have a good offense, your play caller is going to get hired away, and it's really hard to sustain that. Well, the inverse is that if you hire an offensive head coach and you have a really good defensive coordinator, then that guy's going to get hired away the way Vic Fangio did to the Denver Broncos after 2018. And so there's always some risk of that with Dennis Allen being the Bears defensive coordinator, that if he comes in this year and the Bears have a top 5 defense, you know, is he somebody who could get some looks? He's been a head coach before. He could be a head coach candidate again. But I can't help but feel like, I mean, certainly Dennis Allen and Vic Fangio were in different areas because Fangio had never been a head coach before. And so this was kind of like the last big resume push to get him that first head coaching job that he kind of had earned sustainably over time. But with Dennis Allen, he's now been an NFL head coach for 2 different teams fairly unsuccessfully, if I'm going to soften it a little bit, right? 3 years with the Raiders, not great. 3 years with the Saints, there were some moments there, but certainly didn't finish very strong there in New Orleans. And so it doesn't feel to me like, even if the Bears have the number 1 defense in the NFL this season, say they're just as good as the 2018 Bears defense, does that get Dennis Allen a head coaching job 1 year removed from being fired midseason by the Saints? You know, like, are NFL teams going to be willing to give Dennis Allen his 3rd head coaching job after one really great season as a defensive coordinator? Maybe. I mean, it always depends on how many openings there are, what the rest of the coaching pool looks like, right? I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but it seems a lot less likely to me that Dennis Allen is going to get hired as a head coach anytime soon. I could see if he puts together 2 or 3 or 4 seasons of being a really good defensive coordinator for the Bears, maybe another team gives him a look, but it feels to me like after 2 failed head coaching gigs that maybe Dennis Allen slots into this like Steve Spagnuolo perception of like, he's just always going to be a good defensive coordinator, but he's not going to get another head coaching job again. I mean, maybe not never again, but like, he's just one of those guys that the NFL collectively decides, we've seen what he's like as a head coach a couple times and we're done with it. Kind of like Jim Schwartz, who's defensive coordinator now with the Cleveland Browns. Like, he had a couple of head coaching opportunities, didn't go well, but he's a great defensive coordinator. And that's a really valuable for that team then to say, hey, we have a great defensive coordinator And we know he's not going anywhere because other teams don't want to risk making him their head coach. So that makes any success Dennis Allen has with the Bears potentially more sustainable than it was for Vic Fangio. Again, this assumes Dennis Allen is super, super successful. That we're making that a foregone conclusion, which I think we have reason to be confident in Dennis Allen, but we don't know for sure how well his system's going to work on this Bears team with these players specifically. That he still has to earn that and prove that he can be a great defensive coordinator for the team. But it feels like he's not going to get hired away. Like you're not going to lose him in that regard. And then for Ben Johnson, compared to Matt Nagy, Ben is a much more proven play caller, much more experienced, not as a head coach, but as a bright offensive mind. Matt Nagy had spent his entire career with Andy Reid, first on the Eagles technically, and then most of the time with the Chiefs. So he'd only ever worked under one head coach in one offensive system in the NFL, one way of doing things that he comes to Chicago and tries to do his own version of. But Ben Johnson's been not only a play caller for 3 or 4 seasons, but he's worked under, I think, 4 different head coaches on 2 different teams, right? 2 different Dolphin head coaches, 2 different Lions head coaches, different offensive systems, different schemes, different styles, different staffs. He's worked in a lot of different ways, and that doesn't guarantee that he's going to be a great head coach, but it does give him more experience and perspective. And it feels like more experience and perspective is always going to be better than less experience and less perspective. So there's something that feels a little bit more stable and sustainable about that. Then you look at the draft pick situation, right? The Bears didn't make that big all-in splash trade for Khalil Mack. Bears fans wanted to see them do it for Trey Hendrickson of the Bengals, or now TJ Watt from the Steelers is kind of the name du jour, but like you're going to be really hard pressed to keep filling your roster with young, cheap players because you need to have draft picks. The Bears still have a lot of draft pick capital in the short and long-term future here to keep loading up this roster. They have all of their picks plus an extra 7th-round pick projected for next year as a compensatory pick. Like they've got the ability to keep this roster stocked. Even in the cap space department, they're a little bit more limited because they got a lot of money tied up in future deals. And I think there'll be more limitations in free agency next season, but they should be able to at least keep the guys they want to keep around and they have some room to create some more financial flexibility in the future because they haven't backloaded these deals. Like Ryan Pace used to keep restructuring contracts and pushing that money in the future and getting into some of the same salary cap trouble that the New Orleans Saints were getting in with Dennis Allen. Ryan Poles has not dabbled in much of that yet. He has maintained a lot more flexibility on his contracts to where he could create more space if he needs to, but he's not hamstrung and stuck with guys loaded up on these these super guaranteed deals that are really, really hard for them to get out of. And then even from like a roster team building standpoint, I think there's a feeling around this Bears team in 2025 that the defense should be good and the offense should be good. And maybe they'll be a little bit less, I don't want to say one-sided than the 2018 Bears, because it wasn't as though the offense was bad in 2018, but clearly that 2018 Bears team was carried by its defense. I mean, they were top 10 in scoring, but that's in part because of all the turnovers on defense. But like that 2018 Bears offense was 21st in passing yards. They were 11th in rushing yards, but they were 27th in yards per carry. They were 14th in yards per pass attempt. Like they were an average offense and an elite defense. They were a little bit one-sided in that regard. And it feels like, in theory, this year's Bears team should be less one-sided. That maybe they're not a top 5 offense or a top 5 defense, but if they're, 8th and 9th in each category, then I think that can be a little bit, and like a legit 8 and 9, not just in scoring, but in terms of yards and stops and turnovers, all the important categories. Like if they're legitimately borderline top 10 offense and borderline top 10 defense, they can be more balanced, and the offense and defense can each kind of carry its own weight, and you won't be so dependent on one side of the ball sustaining a perhaps unsustainable level of success like that 2018 Bears defense. They were never going to be that great every season. They stayed good, but they were never going to be that dominant every season. So the Bears can't count on a defense being that dominant every season, or even an offense being that dominant every season. But if you can count on them both being pretty good, that should be able to last a little bit longer. Again, I want to just one more time reiterate, like this is all assuming 2025 goes great and then how you sustain that. But I think given where the expectations are, we're looking at things being improved this season, and then it's trying to sustain that improvement from there. And that's what I wanted to compare when Matt Nagy improved the Bears quite a bit and won Coach of the Year, to now Ben Johnson being the favorite early on for Coach of the Year. With training camp right around the corner, we'll see how they get started on this 2025 campaign towards that Coach of the Year effort for this team. And so you can be sure we'll break down any and all Bears training camp updates as players report late this week and into early next week when the rookies start coming in. You can be sure, or when the veterans start coming in, you can be sure we'll have it all covered for you on Locked On Bears. So make sure you hit the subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our Chicago Bears news and analysis. Coming up this week, really tomorrow, the Locked On NFL Top 100 will be released at 9 o'clock a.m. Central Time over on the Locked On Sports Today podcast. It's our Locked On Podcast Network's Top 100. It was voted on by us, the NFL hosts here of Locked On, and there's some real stunners in there. I advocated for a few Chicago Bears to clock into the top 100, but we're going to have to tune in to see exactly where they land, and we'll break them down for you here on this podcast as well. So don't miss where your favorite players are ranked. Subscribe to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Come back on Thursday for Locked On Bears for another opportunity for you to bear down.